The grand concert hall glowed with chandeliers as guests in elegant gowns and suits filled the velvet seats. The air buzzed with chatter and expectation as the city's most talented musicians prepared to perform. Backstage, musicians tuned their instruments, while stagehands hurried with last-minute details. Amid the chaos, a quiet janitor pushed his mop across the polished marble floor unnoticed by almost everyone. His name was Samuel. He was older than most of the performers, his back slightly bent from years of work. To the musicians, he was invisible, just the man who emptied trash and swept the stage after their performances. Some even snickered as he passed, whispering jokes about how he probably could not tell the difference between a piano and a violin. But what no one knew was that Samuel had once dreamed of standing under those very same lights. In his younger days, he had studied music late into the night, teaching himself the piano by ear. Life had been unkind and circumstances forced him into simple work. Yet the melodies never left his heart, and every evening when the hall emptied, he would sit at the piano and play until the night watchman came. On the evening of the recital, the maestro himself noticed Samuel lingering near the piano. The maestro raised an eyebrow and asked what a janitor was doing hovering so close to the instrument. Before Samuel could answer, a few musicians laughed and said maybe he wanted to try a mop-handle symphony. The hall echoed with chuckles, and Samuel lowered his head, quietly returning to his work. But fate had other plans. One of the performers scheduled for the evening fell ill just minutes before taking the stage. The program director panicked, whispering frantically that there was no replacement. The maestro sighed in frustration, looking around for any solution when his eyes landed once more on Samuel. The idea seemed absurd, yet something in Samuel's steady gaze gave the maestro pause. The maestro asked Samuel if he knew how to play. The musicians burst out laughing, some doubling over at the thought. But Samuel simply nodded, his hands still gripping the mop handle, as if it were a staff of courage. The maestro, after a long silence, ordered that Samuel be given a chance, since the hall was already full and time was running out. The laughter in the room turned into murmurs of disbelief as Samuel was led to the grand piano. He sat slowly, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he touched the keys. For a heartbeat, the hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a disaster. But then Samuel's fingers began to move, and the first melody poured into the air. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, like whispers floating across the hall. But then Samuel's hands found their rhythm, and the music grew fuller, deeper, carrying a warmth that wrapped around every listener. The laughter died at once, replaced by silence, so heavy it felt sacred. Every chord struck with a purity that no sheet music could ever capture, and the hall leaned forward as one. The maestro's eyes widened, his hand slowly lowering from his chest where he had pressed it in surprise. The musicians who had mocked Samuel now stood frozen, their smirks erased, replaced with awe. The audience sat spellbound, unable to believe the janitor, whose face they had never noticed, could summon such beauty from the keys. Each note told a story of hardship and hope, of nights spent in solitude chasing dreams that had never fully died. Samuel's back straightened as he played, his confidence blooming with each passing moment. The trembling in his hands vanished, replaced with strength and certainty, as though he was reclaiming a piece of himself long lost. The melody swelled, soaring through the rafters of the grand hall like a bird finally set free. People in the crowd felt tears prick their eyes, though they could not explain why. When the final notes lingered in the air before fading into silence, the hall remained still. It was as if no one dared to breathe, afraid the magic might break. Then a single pair of hands began to clap, followed by another and another, until the entire hall erupted in thunderous applause. The sound rolled over Samuel like a wave, the very same people who had laughed now standing to honor him. Samuel bowed his head, his chest rising with a deep breath, his heart pounding louder than the applause itself. For the first time, he felt seen, truly seen. And though he said nothing, his music had already spoken louder than words ever could. The maestro stepped forward, raising his hand for quiet, though his own expression betrayed his astonishment. When the hall hushed, he turned to Samuel, his voice carrying through the silence, and asked where he had learned to play like that. Samuel lifted his eyes, his voice calm and low, saying he had learned alone after long nights of work and long years of dreaming. The audience gasped at his words, some unable to believe that such brilliance could come without training. The maestro studied him for a moment and then extended his hand with a respect no one had shown Samuel before. Samuel hesitated before taking it, and the hall erupted once more in applause, this time louder, more genuine than before. Musicians who had mocked him now avoided his eyes, some ashamed, others humbled by what they had just witnessed. Samuel, however, did not seek their apology. He only looked at the piano with quiet gratitude, as if greeting an old friend. Backstage, whispers spread like fire. Who was this janitor who could play better than the students of masters? How could a man who spent his life sweeping floors conjure music that stirred the soul so deeply? The performers who had prepared all year now felt overshadowed by someone they had never once considered a peer. The director hurried to Samuel with excitement, asking if he would play another piece for the audience. Samuel hesitated again, unsure if this was his place, but the calls from the crowd grew louder and louder. Play again, echoed through the grand hall as people leaned forward waiting for the miracle to return. Samuel finally nodded, his fingers brushing the keys once more as the hall held its breath in reverence. Samuel closed his eyes and began a new melody, one softer than the first, like a lullaby carried on the wind. The notes trickled gently into the vast hall, weaving through the silence and settling deep into the hearts of every listener. This time there was no laughter, no whispers, only the quiet sound of breath as the audience leaned closer, drawn into the spell. The chandeliers above seemed to shimmer in rhythm, as if the very walls of the hall wanted to listen. The maestro moved to the side of the stage, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his eyes never leaving Samuel's fingers. It was rare even for him, a man who had traveled the world, to hear such raw, untouched genius. Each phrase of the music carried sorrow and triumph blended together in a way no trained ear could ever predict. It was as if Samuel poured his life story into every note, and the piano answered him faithfully. Tears streaked the cheeks of strangers in the audience, some holding handkerchiefs to their faces. Even the proudest musicians who had moments before looked at Samuel with disdain now stood spellbound. They saw not a janitor, but an artist, a master who needed no title or stage to prove his worth. Samuel continued, playing not for their applause, not for their approval, but for the joy that burned in his own soul. When the final note faded into silence, the hall erupted again with a roar greater than before. The applause shook the rafters, people rising to their feet, cheering and shouting his name. Samuel bowed slightly, his hands still trembling, though now with a different kind of weight. For in that moment, he knew the years of being unseen, forgotten, and underestimated had melted away under the glow of the music. As the ovation thundered, Samuel slowly stood from the piano bench, his weathered hands resting gently on the polished wood. The maestro walked toward him and placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture filled with respect rather than pity. He turned to the audience and declared that sometimes greatness hides in the most unexpected places. The hall responded with another surge of applause, their cheers echoing off the marble walls. Samuel lowered his gaze, humbled by the attention, yet there was a quiet pride in the way he stood. The same people who had once ignored him now craned their necks to catch a better glimpse of him. Backstage, the young musicians whispered fiercely, their jealousy mixing with awe. Some asked how many years he had trained, others shook their heads, unable to accept that he was self-taught. The director hurried forward, eyes alight with opportunity. He asked Samuel if he would consider playing in more recitals, perhaps even touring with the company. Gasps spread through the crowd as whispers of agreement rose, many already nodding, eager for more of Samuel's music. Samuel listened silently, his mind turning not to fame, but to the piano itself, the instrument that had been his companion through years of solitude. The audience clapped again, calling out for one more piece, one more song to close the evening. Samuel smiled faintly and returned to the bench, his fingers hovering over the keys. This time, he did not hesitate. He let his hands fall into motion, and the hall once more drowned in the beauty of his sound. The music rose and fell like waves, steady, strong, and endless, carrying every listener with it into a place only Samuel could lead. The melody Samuel chose was unlike the others. It carried a quiet fire hidden beneath its gentle surface. Each note built upon the last, rising higher and higher until the hall seemed to vibrate with its force. The audience leaned forward, some clutching their seats, as if the sound itself pulled them closer. It was not just music, it was a confession, a revelation of every moment Samuel had endured in silence. The maestro closed his eyes, listening, his fingers twitching slightly, as though conducting the invisible orchestra Samuel created. For the first time in years, the maestro himself felt humbled, as if he too were only a student in the presence of something greater. The younger musicians backstage pressed closer to the curtains, unable to look away from the janitor they had once mocked. Now they whispered to one another, not with ridicule, but with awe, their voices trembling as though speaking too loudly might break the spell. Samuel's posture was no longer bent or weary. He sat tall, his back straight, his hands flying across the keys with grace and strength. He looked like a man reborn, as though the music had lifted him out of the life that had once chained him. The hall was no longer filled with strangers, it was filled with witnesses to his truth, his unshakable spirit-given sound. When the final chord rang out long and strong, the silence that followed was so deep it felt endless. Then the roar came, louder than any before, feet stomping, hands clapping, voices crying out his name. Samuel stood and bowed his head, his face lined with humility, but his eyes glowing with something brighter than pride. The maestro raised his arms to the audience, signaling them to continue, and the ovation thundered on, refusing to end. Samuel had not only played music, he had changed the way every soul in that hall would see him and themselves forever. The director rushed onto the stage, his face flushed with excitement as he tried to speak over the roaring crowd. He announced that the concert hall had just witnessed history and that Samuel's name would not be forgotten. The audience cheered louder, some even rising onto their seats to make their applause heard above the rest. Samuel remained still, his hands folded in front of him, his gaze lowered, as though he could hardly believe this was real. The maestro stepped beside him again and declared that talent like this must be shared with the world. He spoke with conviction, promising that Samuel would be given the chance to play on grander stages before larger audiences. Gasps and applause swept through the hall at the announcement, many already whispering about how they had been lucky enough to witness his first true performance. The musicians who once mocked him now clapped the hardest, desperate to mask their shame with admiration. Samuel finally lifted his head, his eyes glistening, as he looked out at the sea of faces. He saw not just wealthy patrons and finely dressed musicians, but human beings moved by the same language he had carried in his heart for years. The crowd quieted as if waiting for him to speak, though Samuel let the silence linger. At last, in a voice soft yet steady, he thanked them not for their praise, but for listening, truly listening to the music. The hall erupted again with applause, but this time it was different. It carried a respect that reached Samuel in a way no words ever had. He turned back to the piano, resting his hand on the keys almost lovingly, as though it too deserved gratitude. The maestro whispered something in his ear, words of encouragement and perhaps even invitation, but Samuel only nodded. For Samuel knew the journey had only just begun, and the music within him was far from finished. The lights of the hall glimmered against Samuel's worn uniform as he stood at the center of the stage. The people who had once walked past him without notice now shouted his name, their voices filled with admiration. The maestro raised his hand again, calling for quiet, and then turned to Samuel with a proud smile. He declared that the janitor had become the heart of the evening, and that no other performance could follow his. The audience cheered at the words, some clapping so hard their palms reddened. Samuel bowed, once more, his movements gentle, almost shy, though his presence now carried a weight that filled every corner of the hall. Backstage, the younger musicians whispered about how the world outside these walls would soon know his name. They spoke of newspapers, of reporters, of critics who would write endlessly about the man who rose from obscurity with nothing but music. Samuel stepped away from the piano slowly, as though reluctant to leave it behind. His calloused fingers lingered on the polished wood, tracing its edge, as if thanking it silently for carrying his truth. The director tried to lead him toward the curtain, but the audience shouted for him to return. Play again, they cried, their voices echoing like a demand from the soul of the hall itself. The maestro looked to Samuel and gave a small nod, granting permission without words. Samuel hesitated, his chest rising with a deep breath before he turned back to the piano. He lowered himself once more onto the bench, his body relaxed now, as though the stage truly belonged to him. And as his hands hovered above the keys, the hall fell into silence, waiting for the next gift that only Samuel could give. Samuel let his fingers fall gently onto the keys, and a new tune began to flow, one that carried both strength and tenderness. The melody started slow, like a whisper almost too soft for the ears, but then it grew fuller, richer, as if his very soul had found its voice. The audience leaned closer, their eyes wide, their hearts tethered to every sound that filled the hall. Each note seemed to paint a picture of his life, the struggles, the long nights of loneliness, and the quiet hope that had never left him. The maestro stood at the side of the stage, his eyes moist, though he tried to hide it behind a composed face. He knew that what he was hearing was not just music, but a legacy born out of pain and resilience. The younger musicians backstage no longer whispered, they simply watched, their pride replaced with reverence. Some clasped their hands together, silently promising themselves to practice harder to reach even a fraction of what Samuel carried in his heart. Samuel played on, his eyes closed, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. The hall transformed into something sacred, where sound itself became prayer, and every listener felt part of it. Parents held their children tighter, couples clasped hands, strangers shared glances, as though bound by the same thread. And Samuel, lost in his music, seemed ageless, as if the years of work and wear melted away beneath the glow of the chandeliers. When the melody climbed toward its peak, the sound rang out so powerfully, it was as if the walls themselves would tremble. But instead of breaking, the hall embraced it, echoing the notes with perfect clarity. Samuel's hands slowed, finally resting on the last chord, letting it linger before fading into silence. The audience did not move, they sat suspended in the aftermath of his gift, unable to break the spell quite yet. For several breaths the hall remained frozen, as though time itself had bent to Samuel's music. Then, like a storm breaking, the applause burst forth, shaking the chandeliers and rolling through the grand space. People shouted his name again and again, some pounding the floor with their feet, as if the sound alone could honor him. The roar of their voices filled Samuel's chest in a way no words ever had. Samuel stood slowly from the piano, bowing with quiet grace. His face glowed not with pride but with relief, as if years of silence had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The maestro stepped forward, clapping with both hands, his voice carrying over the noise as he praised Samuel for reminding them all what music was meant to be. The crowd roared even louder, their eyes fixed on the janitor who had become their master. Backstage, the director scribbled notes frantically, already envisioning headlines and programs that would bear Samuel's name. Some performers whispered about invitations to other cities, imagining how quickly word would spread of the night the janitor stunned the hall. Samuel heard none of it. His eyes remained on the piano, the instrument that had always listened when no one else had. He reached out once more and touched the keys gently, as though promising he would return. The audience continued to clap, refusing to let the moment end. The sound was not only for Samuel's music, but for his story, the proof that greatness could be hidden in the most humble of lives. And as Samuel looked out across the sea of faces, he finally lifted his head, fully standing tall beneath the lights of the hall. For the first time, he was no longer invisible. He was seen, heard, and remembered. The director rushed to Samuel's side, whispering urgently about contracts and opportunities, his words tumbling over each other in excitement. But Samuel barely reacted, his gaze still fixed on the rows of faces that now looked at him with respect instead of dismissal. He felt a strange calm wash over him, as though the applause belonged less to him and more to the music itself. The same melodies that had kept him company during lonely nights were now shared with the world. The maestro raised his hand once more, and the audience fell into silence, waiting for him to speak. He turned to Samuel, his voice carrying with weight, as he declared that talent of such purity was rare, a gift that could not be taught. The words echoed through the hall, and Samuel felt the truth of them settle deep within him. For years he had doubted whether his music had value, and now the answer stood before him in the eyes of every person listening. Backstage, a few of the younger musicians stepped forward, their faces no longer filled with arrogance, but with admiration. One of them even approached Samuel hesitantly, bowing their head and thanking him for showing them what music truly meant. Samuel gave a small nod, offering them a quiet smile before returning his focus to the piano. The instrument seemed to wait for him, as if it too understood that the bond they shared had carried him to this moment. The crowd began to chant his name again, urging him to play once more. Samuel took a deep breath and lowered himself back onto the bench that no longer felt like borrowed space. His hands hovered above the keys, and the hall hushed instantly, as though the very air itself was holding still. Samuel let his fingers press down, and a new song bloomed, one that promised the night was far from over. The new melody Samuel played carried a gentle strength like the rising of dawn after a long night. Each note shimmered softly, filling the hall with a warmth that seemed to ease every restless heart. The audience leaned forward again, their eyes glistening, as if the music itself was reaching into places words could never touch. Samuel's fingers moved with effortless grace, as though he had been waiting his whole life for this very moment. The maestro stood motionless, his arms folded behind his back, his head slightly bowed in respect. He knew he was witnessing something rare, something no amount of training or discipline could ever produce. The younger musicians backstage clutched their instruments with silent reverence, their pride dissolved into pure admiration. Some wiped tears from their eyes, though they did not dare speak for fear of breaking the spell. Samuel continued his playing, his body swaying gently with a rhythm, his face calm and serene. To him, the grand concert hall no longer felt intimidating, it felt like home. The piano answered every touch of his hand with perfect devotion, the bond between man and instrument unshakable. The sound rose higher, filling the rafters, until even the chandeliers seemed to hum with the resonance. When Samuel slowed the melody down to its quietest breath, the audience leaned closer, holding still, as if afraid to miss even a single note. The final chord lingered in the air, stretching across the silence, before dissolving into nothingness. For a long moment, no one moved, the hall caught in the fragile beauty of what they had just heard. And then, as if released from a spell, the crowd erupted once more, their applause booming like thunder. The thunder of the applause rolled through the hall, and Samuel stood slowly from the piano bench, his shoulders squared now with quiet pride. The audience clapped and cheered, some shouting his name while others simply stood in silence, their faces glowing with awe. The maestro stepped forward again, raising Samuel's hand high in the air as though presenting a champion to the world. The gesture sent the crowd into another roar, their cheers shaking the very walls. Samuel lowered his gaze humbly, though inside he felt a fire burning brighter than ever before. For the first time, he understood that all those lonely nights of practice had not been in vain. The music he carried had been waiting for this moment to be shared, to remind others of the power it could hold. The piano behind him gleamed under the stage lights, as if it too shared in his triumph. Backstage, the directors spoke rapidly with staff already arranging for future performances. Some whispered of invitations from other cities and letters that would soon arrive from across the country. The younger musicians who had once laughed at him now clapped the loudest, their shame hidden beneath their admiration. But Samuel saw none of this. His attention remained with the music still echoing in his heart. The audience began to chant again, calling for more, their voices unified in a demand for his return to the bench. Samuel gave a faint smile, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear but from the overwhelming tide of emotion that carried him. He turned back to the piano and placed his fingers gently upon the keys. The hall fell silent instantly, every soul waiting for Samuel to open another doorway into his world. Samuel pressed the first key, and the hall seemed to sigh as the sound floated through the air. This melody was different, softer than the others, like a quiet conversation between his heart and the piano. The notes rose and fell like a gentle tide, pulling the audience deeper with every phrase. No one moved, not even a cough disturbed the stillness as Samuel poured himself into the music. The maestro stood at the side, his chest rising with deep breaths, as if he too was carried away. He whispered to those near him that this was the kind of music that could change a life forever. Backstage, the young musicians leaned forward, unable to take their eyes from Samuel's hands. They saw no mop, no broom, no trace of the janitor they had mocked, only the hands of a master. Samuel's eyes remained closed as he played, his body swaying slowly with each passing measure. In that moment, he belonged not to the hall, not to the crowd, but to the music itself. The instrument became an extension of him, every note blooming like a truth spoken aloud for the first time. The sound was not loud or boastful, it was pure, honest, and unshakably human. As the final chord rang out, Samuel let his hands rest on the keys for a moment longer. The silence that followed was so deep it felt as though the world outside the hall had disappeared. Then the audience rose, all at once, their applause exploding like a storm, their voices chanting his name again and again. Samuel stood slowly, bowing his head, his eyes glistening with a light that had been hidden for far too long. The ovation thundered on until the maestro raised his hand to calm the crowd. He turned to Samuel, his voice carrying across the hall, and declared that they had not only witnessed a performance, but a revelation. The audience cheered again, their admiration rolling through the hall like waves crashing upon a shore. Samuel bowed once more, his hands still trembling from the music he had given. For the first time in his life, he did not feel small or invisible. He felt whole, as though every step of hardship had led to this single night. The piano gleamed behind him, its polished surface reflecting the lights like a crown bestowed upon a king. Backstage, the director hurried to him, papers in hand, promises of contracts, tours, and endless opportunity. The maestro simply placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder, whispering that greatness had always been his, he had only needed the world to see it. Samuel smiled faintly, his eyes drifting to the audience, who continued to cheer and clap, refusing to let him leave unseen again. As the curtains slowly drew shut, Samuel turned back for one last glance at the piano. He knew his life would never be the same, yet in his heart he remained the same man who played in empty halls when no one listened. Only now the world was listening, and it would never forget the janitor who silenced a concert hall with nothing but truth in his music. And so Samuel stepped into the shadows of the stage, his heart lighter, his spirit unbound, his story only just beginning.